Okay, folks, welcome to webinar number 9 in a series. This one's primarily for private inspection. We're going to look at SPM standards, how they relate to inspection, but mostly ASTTBC policy for inspectors. I'm Jim Anderson, for those of you who don't know me, and all this preparation, and I still didn't have the right screen up to run the... Here we go. All right. So a few webinar management details, and those of you who have been here for all the previous ones, bear with me because there's so many new people. I'm going to run through all the introductions all over again. Take a couple of minutes, I imagine. So screen sharing is by GoToTraining, and the toolbox or the toolbar has a chat window down close to the bottom with a plus and a minus. So if you hit that plus sign, it opens up that chat box, and you can see you can type messages in there. Even if your phone's muted, you can get our attention. And if you have it open, you'll see what anybody else is entering in there. Audio is by phone, and if you can hear me, obviously that's working. And we do that because the built-in features in GoTo are voice over internet, and they're kind of dodgy. It's not very reliable, especially for people who don't have really good internet connection. So that's why we're using the phone, which means that any of the features in the GoTo toolbars for microphones and that kind of thing are not going to be working. And then there's a bunch of us on the phone. So to manage background noise, *6 on your phone to mute your phone, and then *6 again to unmute it if you want to ask a question or join in the discussion. You might want to make a little sticky note in that regard, or just remember *6. Anybody have any doubt if their phone's muted? You can say something. I don't hear anybody, so phone muting must be working. And interject anytime, especially if I make an error, which has certainly happened. If I say SPM 2 and I mean SPM 3 or something like that, feel free to weigh in immediately. And you can weigh in with a question immediately as well, or a comment or whatever. But every once in a while, I'll pause for questions. In other words, I'll invite questions at specific points, and then at the end of it all, we'll stay on the phone as long as anybody wants to chat. So that'll be a good time to bring up questions that maybe are a little bit off topic, or if you wanted to just hold questions till then, that's fine. So questions anytime, or when I invite them at key points, or at the end. We are recording this webinar. The goal is to put the recordings on our learning resources page, which we've done with the other ones, but we're not recording you, for privacy issues and so on. So it's just my voice being recorded. But for that reason, if you're asking a question, I'll try to verbally paraphrase it so that it makes it into the recording, if you know what I mean. So again, my voice is the only one being recorded. Quick bio, I guess. I'm Jim Anderson, the compliance officer for ASTTBC on the on-site wastewater side. Come from an excavating background, 55 years old, transitioned into education in my early 40s. And what? As a practitioner, I'm an installer, planner, private inspector, and maintenance provider. That's probably...
New participant has joined the conference.
Good enough for now.
Jim Rabbit.
Moving on. So the webinars, they're intended for several different types of participants, including people who don't particularly have to be here, just voluntarily participating, who want to review or simply to improve their competency. The second group is ropes who didn't attend or didn't successfully complete the SPM workshops that Michael Payne and I put on across the province, October to January. Those were compulsory, and so a lot of people didn't attend, and they'll have to write a test, and other people attended, but they didn't hand in the exercises, or they got 60% or less on those very easy exercises. The third group is ropes who have been registered since January of this year. Another group is people who are thinking about registering, people who are just here to try to clarify expectations, improve their competency. So groups 2, 3, and 4 are required to complete examinations by the end of the year as a condition of ongoing registration. And these webinars are intended to help you prepare for those exams. And the first group, again, is just volunteers, and they don't have to write any exams. So moving on, the intended duration is about an hour. Typically, they've been going a little bit over, and then followed by questions and discussion. It is number 9 in the series. Previous recordings are available on the Learning Resources webpage. I'll show you that in a minute. We encourage you to use those learning resources, especially if you have to write the exam. In other words, we've created some practice quizzes with some answer sheets and what have you. And even if you don't have to write the exam, they'll be good CPD, right? Good continuing professional development, and help clarify things for you. But we do want to point out that the learning resources and or these webinars, they don't deliver everything you need to know, whether that be for registration application or for passing that exam. We can't possibly do that in a few evening sessions, and it is meant just to help guide your self-directed learning. The exams and the registration requirements to become a rope assume there's some pre-existing experience, and assume that you've taken some fairly extensive training from one of the other training providers. So be prepared for some self-study. Continuing professional development. I'm going to turn off my camera, by the way. It's just distracting to you and me. I'll stop that. There we go. Continuing professional development. If you're an ASTT member, you can claim CPD points. As you know, it's a requirement now to do CPD and to track it and report it as a condition of ongoing registration. And this certainly qualifies. So from the policy, there's at least 2 applicable categories. To make a long story short, one of the categories lists 1 point for every 8 hours, the other one for every 7. So we've decided that it seems reasonable to declare 2 hours for each webinar, 1 point for 4 webinars, quarter point apiece, and so on. If you go through the learning exercises, you can claim CPD for that, and you'll have to refer to the policy, which is here. So just to show you, I mean, you can use any search engine. Let's go to Google, just because people are familiar with it. And you can get to where I'm trying to go by Googling ASTTBC, the front page, and working your way through a fairly convoluted path. Or you can go a little more direct by Googling OWRP, On-Site Wastewater Registration Program. You probably could have Googled SPM Learning Resources as well. But at any rate, let's try this, OWRP. So, brings us there. It's set up with practitioner side, consumer side. The information we're looking at is for practitioners, so I'll go there. While I am here, top more or less center is a tab, Documents. I'm just going to go there just to show you. For one thing, this is where the CPD policy is. Where is it? Yeah, sure. Can't see it right now. It's in here somewhere. Here's our registration policy. Here's Appendix G, the standard guidelines for inspection. There's a bunch of other good things in here. Here are some examples of reports for inspection. So that's right on topic for today. Right? There's some good resources for you. And there's some planning examples, some other links and so on. You can see what's there. It's also a place to download the SPM for free. Digital version is very helpful because it has digital search features and so on. You can get the SSR there and so on. If you want a paper version of the SPM3, you can contact the office, Julie Lee, and she'll sell you one for $50. Okay, while we're here, I wanted to show you the Learning Resources page. So top left, SPM Learning Resources. If I click on that, come on, slow internet, it brings you to this page. And this page has some information on the right about whether you need to write an exam or not. If you do, you probably got a letter from the registrar saying so. It has a link here that I haven't mentioned a lot for those of you who have been in the previous webinars. This is an error sheet, an errata sheet that several of us, mostly Michael Payne and Ian Ralston, put together. So it captures some of the typos.
This participant has joined the conference.
So it captures some of the errors, some of the typos, and explains some of the things that remained a little bit confusing. So we should probably all download that and have a look at it. It has some videos. There's one from Ron Hine, Dead Center. Here's some videos from Ron, self-explanatory titles. Here are the recordings for the previous webinars, which a bunch of you are going to want to access. A little more on that later. Here are the learning exercises that I did. They're basically practice quizzes. The answer sheets that accompany them, in some cases at least, have some notes explaining how you come up with the right answer. So that'll be crucial to you if you are needing to write the exam, and even if you're not. Helpful learning, I hope. So that is our learning resources page. Probably enough said for now on that. Any questions or discussion on that so far? Everybody's okay? Alrighty. Learning goals. It's good to know what we're trying to accomplish. We're going to look at inspectors' responsibilities for SPM compliance, and mostly we're going to be looking at the standard practice guidelines for inspections, which is not the SPM. It's an ASTT document, and along the way we'll talk about best practices for inspection. Inspectors should access previous webinars, especially if you need to write the exam. A lot of people are dropping in now for the first time. So just to give you the heads up, webinar number 1 was intended for everybody, installers, maintenance, planning, and inspectors, and it goes through the new format and the key changes. Webinar number 2 was for DDF, Daily Design Flow. I hope everybody understands that inspectors definitely need that, so do all the planners. Vertical separation and loading rates. And then number 5 was specification and installation standards that everybody needs, including maintenance providers, inspectors, and so on. Planners create specs, installers put the stuff in the ground, and the rest of us have to know the specs for installation. Number 7 was for maintenance and monitoring standards, basically for planners and inspectors, right? Because planners need to do maintenance plans, inspectors need to understand maintenance, and so on. And then number 8 was for installers only. Did I get that right? Yeah, I think so. Number 6 was for installers. Number 8 was for maintenance providers, where we did just a high-level review of the fundamentals of daily design flow, vertical separation, system selection standards, and so on. So I'd encourage you to look at those and go back and access those. Within the slideshow, quotes are shown in italics. You may wish to follow along in your own copy of the policy. I'm sure you all got one in your nightstand, right? But if not, don't worry, I'll put it up on screen. So let's get started. I want to talk about shared liability a little bit. Inspectors are exposed to huge liability risks. Pretty clear to me that there's more liability risk in inspection than there is for install, planning, and maintenance. One reason is that people rely on our conclusions to buy a house or not, right, or a property. And if something goes wrong, a few months later, they'll blame you. What you're doing as an inspector is you're offering an opinion or making conclusions on how the thing is working, how big it is, where it is, and so on the day of your inspection. So the day of your inspection, everything might be fine. But if they move in, they have different usage patterns, maybe they have a lot more occupants and so on. Oftentimes the system fails, quote unquote, it's not really a good term, but it goes into performance malfunction after a sale. And then you're the first one they're going to sue. And I could go on, but in the interest of time, I guess I just want to let that point hang there, that there's huge liability risks for inspectors. Inspectors get in trouble in the courts all the time. And we also have a lot of practice review board cases. In other words, a lot of complaints. Anybody want to weigh in on that? Anybody got a good story of how you got in trouble as an inspector? Great. So one reason why we have so much liability is we're making conclusions about the capacity, the performance, and the condition. So in terms of liability, we're making conclusions on whether the thing is still receiving effluent, still working properly, and that's precarious, right? We're making some comments on its condition without committing ourselves. We're not saying it's going to last X number of years, but we are making conclusions about that, and we're making conclusions about the capacity. In other words, what is the treatment capacity of the system? What's the size of the tanks and the dispersal system suited for? So for all those reasons, our butt is on the line. Those conclusions require you to know what standard practice is. Hopefully that's clear. That was just meant to be truck driver language. You got to know what you're doing because you're making conclusions that affects people's lives. And the best defense is due diligence. A little bit more about due diligence coming up. But due diligence is a legal concept. I'm no lawyer. But in truck driver terms, the concept is what would a reasonable person do in the same circumstance. Lawyers sue everybody. Right? If there's something gone wrong with the system, they're going to sue every practitioner that has had any involvement with it, including the inspector. The judge is going to look at the actions of all parties, including the inspector. They're going to evaluate your due diligence. At law, you're considered a professional. Not professional like an engineer in the SSR context, but a professional in the sense that you're a qualified person. Therefore, you're held to a higher standard of due diligence. The law, the burden under the law is that you actually know what you're doing. And you need to be prepared to demonstrate due diligence in order to stay out of trouble, which includes things like taking pictures, good reporting, field notes, contracts, and so on. As an authorized person, you're responsible for SSR compliance. I hope that's clear. If you're also an installer and a planner, and as a result of an inspection, you decide you're going to do some repairs, all the SSR rules apply, right? Need a filing before you do it, and so on. 30 meters to wells, all that good stuff. As a rope, you're responsible for compliance with the Code of Ethics. Is there anybody's phone unmuted? *6 to mute your phone. Moving on. So Code of Ethics is what gets people in trouble with Practice Review Board. Practice Review Board and the judge in civil court doesn't care that much about subtle little issues from the SPM, right? Arguably the SPM is just one source of standard practice anyway. So if you were supposed to have 100 orifices in your system and you only had 90, frankly, nobody really cares, unless it's the compliance officer doing a practice review or something. But Code of Ethics is how you're going to get in trouble. So you need to be familiar with it, and you need to protect yourself against allegations that you've breached the Code of Ethics. You're also responsible for policy, on-site wastewater certification board policy, practice guidelines, and so on. The policy, among other things, says that as a rope you have to follow the SPM as your primary source of standard practice. If you're going to follow, guidelines from Minnesota or something, then you need professional written advice. The practice guidelines are part of policy. And in tonight's context, there's practice guidelines for all ropes, and then there's a specific practice guideline appendix that's for inspection. And policy says that if you're doing inspection, you have to follow those guidelines. And they're quite lengthy. Hopefully you're not seeing it as a burden so much as a help, because those are intended to help you demonstrate due diligence and stay out of trouble. As a contractor, I hope everybody realizes you have lots of exposure to liability, period, especially when part of your work is making conclusions about system condition and so on. So there's lots of liability out there, lots of people getting in trouble. We talked about Code of Ethics, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them, not going to show them, but you probably are familiar with them, right? Yeah, should be. Principle 2 talks about qualifications, and we're going to talk about what kind of qualifications you need to do inspections, but the principle essentially says you have to have the training, knowledge, experience, and equipment to do the job. Principle 3 talks about adequate knowledge. So if you're saying the system is working as intended by its design, that had better be based on an adequate depth of inspection. Perhaps even worse is if you say it's in a performance malfunction, you better be right. Otherwise you're in breach of Principle 3. Principle 1 is the one that is breached most often or is cited in practice review cases, and it deals with protecting the public interest and the environment. Probably enough said on Code of Ethics. Any questions on Code of Ethics? Everybody really should look at them, You should be familiar with them and the amplification statements. As I said, that's the quickest path to trouble, is to not be able to demonstrate that you're following the Code of Ethics. Goals for inspectors, just in general, just staying out of trouble. There's an awful lot of trouble to be had in inspection, so hopefully everybody has that as their sort of primary focus, is the way you do the work and the way you handle your business is all about staying out of trouble. Along the way, hopefully we want to provide excellent service and be an expert and apply best practices and so on. If for no other reason, then it helps us stay out of trouble, right? It's all about demonstrating due diligence. So if you're good at it and you know what you're doing, a better chance of staying out of trouble. The other reason is it's the way to make money, right? So, inspection. Which standards apply is the question I'm posing. And the answer is all of them. The vision for the industry was that inspectors would be the most knowledgeable of all practitioners. They would be the ones who would have the most experience and would have taken all the courses and be extremely well versed in the SPM. So that means the entire SPM, inspectors need to know more than any of the rest of us, frankly. But it's not just the SPM. Back to that in a sec. One reason that we need to know all the standards is we have to assess the system location, making sure that it meets all the setbacks and all the other issues, the configuration and sizing, including vertical separation and so on. So we need to be sure that we're experts at the SPM, because we make conclusions about compliance with the standards. It's part of our reporting required scope of work. But here's the trick, is it's the standards of the day. So if we're inspecting a system that was built in 2004 or 1969, we're not dealing with the sewage system regulation, we're dealing with the old regulation and the old standards. So our job in that case is to compare what's in the ground, what we're seeing, with the standards of the day. So for that reason, not only do we need to know the entire SPM, we also need to know, or at least be familiar with, the old regulation. You need a copy of that. I've got a digital one that I can send you. It's actually not easy to find. So we should be familiar with the old regulation, at least be able to find things when we run across old systems. As most of you know, it's completely different rules for DDF and system sizing. It's a weird regulation. If you read it carefully, there's basically no requirement for vertical separation. Somewhere in there it says you can have 2 feet of soil and you can cut in a 2-foot deep ditch, which means you have 0 VS, but that was not the intent. At any rate, I digress. You need to be familiar with the old reg and the new, the SSR. A lot of people, oddly enough, are not familiar with the SSR. They're familiar with the SPM, but not the regulation. Well, the regulation is actually something we have to follow, right? The SPM is arguably a bit of a guideline. So we have to be familiar with the old regulation, the new regulation, all the SPMs, and the entire SPM. So if we're dealing with a system that was built from 05 to 07, we need to compare it to SPM version 1, and in the interim version 2, and now version 3. So you need all 3 of those on your bookshelf, so to speak. Moving on to policies. So ASTT policies are basically what administer or guide or lay out the expectations for inspection. By the way, maybe it was one of the latecomers on the conference call. *6 to mute your phone to control background noise, please. *6 on your phone. Anybody have any doubt? There's somebody unmuted. It's a little bit aggravating. *6, thank you. Okay, so the policies are in transition, and up until now, you didn't, strictly speaking, have to be a private inspector. But that is changing. I guess I'm just going to mute everybody because somebody still has their phone. Just bear with me a minute here. Where is that? *5. There. Hopefully everybody's muted. Okay, so that means if you need to interject now, you're going to have to use the chat window unless I unmute everybody again. So, moving on. Private inspection registration will no longer be optional. I didn't make that decision. I'm not even sure that I agree with it, but there it is. You used to be able to do it if you were a planner, for example. Policy also lays out that you have to have the training, equipment, skills, and experience to do so, and then the guidelines list some of that equipment. So if you don't have a pipe camera, you're in non-compliance with the policy, basically. Any ASTT member, even if they're an applied science technologist, certified technician, or any rope, has to follow the practice guidelines for inspection. And the reason all that is important is because inspection doesn't show up in the SSR. So basically anybody can do inspections and call it that. But if you're a ASTT member, then you can't. Then you can only do it under these conditions if you're registered as a private inspector and if you follow the guideline. A bit frustrating. I know some of us are competing against home inspectors who are also including septic systems and that kind of thing. So it's a regulatory flaw. Let's move on. Policies. Maybe I will just go there rather than rely on my slides. Make it a little bit smaller for you. And bear with me here. 7. Section 7. So here's the draft policy. It's very similar to the existing policy, and let's look at some key points. I'm going to try to unmute the phone again here. #5, *5 rather.
The conference is in lecture mode. The conference is no longer in lecture mode.
Okay, well let me try to capture some key points here. I touched on this, and here it is in our policy. The SSR and the SPM doesn't say that you need to be an authorized person to do inspections. It's just sort of like silent on the issue. It does say that, you know, to do construction or maintenance, you have to be an authorized person, and construction includes design, but not inspection. So that means that, you know, a retired school teacher or anybody can hang up a shingle and say that they're going to do inspections. But if you're a rope that provides services as an inspector, then you shall be certified and registered with the private inspector endorsement, unless you're making conclusions for the purposes of maintenance, in which case you need to be a maintenance provider. So it's a bit confusing, but I think you get the gist of it, is that you have to be a private inspector in order to do that kind of work. What else do we want to get at here? It does say that we're to make an inspection tailored to the needs of the client. For one thing, whether it's a performance inspection or a compliance inspection and so on. And we have to meet the minimum inspection standards for either inspection type. And those standards are ASTT standards. They're not SPM standards. It talks about ensuring appropriate level of inspection and reporting. And the trick for reporting is to provide adequate information to defend and document conclusions. So if you're saying it's in a performance malfunction and recommending replacement or repair, you need to have information in the report that says why. We've had a lot of complaints, a lot of practice review board cases where one inspector says the system is performance malfunction. Another inspector is hired to offer a second opinion and says everything's just fine. And in some cases, the second opinion was correct. And the private inspector in the first case was either wrong or didn't have photographs and documentation to prove it, so to speak. So this is important to make sure that you defend your conclusions. And then we get this again, that you have to have the qualifications, equipment, competencies, and experience. And the equipment is pipe cameras and some other things. There's two types of inspection, performance and compliance. So I just want to go through this and try to pick out key points rather than rely on my slides. Anybody got any questions to this point? Kind of a silent bunch. A lot of new people tonight, so the people who have been here before, they're more used to interjecting and asking questions and stuff. But okay, fair enough. Let's move on. 22 of us and nobody has a question. So a performance inspection, we need to make the distinction between performance inspection and compliance inspection. And performance is about real estate, typically, right? Real estate transactions. And typically we're working for the prospective buyer, trying to protect the prospective buyer's interests, and arguably, and the suitability for the buyer's intended use. So the system might be okay for the seller's use, but the buyer has got a bigger family or wants to build a shop or a suite or who knows what, right? Has a business or something like that. So that often that's part of a performance inspection. Where else do we want to go here? Wishes to understand. So a performance inspection has less scope than a compliance inspection, but needs to include these things. In writing, right, what system type it is, the general location of each component on the property, not necessarily super accurate in this case. Review of any existing filing documents and compare that to the system as installed. So if the old permit says that it was a 750 gallon tank and 200 feet of runs, and you find out that it's a 400 gallon tank and 100 feet of runs, you need to document that. You need to report that. Supposed to review existing maintenance records. Good luck with that. Nobody does maintenance, right? But you're supposed to try and find out if there is any. In a perfect world, the owner has a folder full of maintenance records. It says compilation of a detailed report, and the report goes to is it working? Is it suitable for the intended use? Are there any recommended or required repairs, maintenance, or improvements? Recommended repair might be install an effluent filter. Required repair might be that the thing is not receiving effluent, clogged trenches or something like that. A compliance inspection is something different. A compliance inspection is typically to support building permits or zoning compliance or similar, but typically building permits. So it's to assist a property owner when making changes to the home, bylaws, building permits, and so on. So it includes everything that the performance inspection did with a little more detail. Now we're trying to make an opinion on whether the existing system is big enough, for example, a renovation with a new bedroom or something like that, right? So for that reason, now it needs to be detailed and precise recording of the location and sizing. The sizing is important. We can't just take a guess that there's 200 feet of trenches and assume, for a performance inspection, we might see that we can tell there's about 200 feet of trenches, but we haven't exposed the width, we haven't dug. But if we assume that they're 3 feet wide, then the infiltrative surface is so-and-so, which should be good for your intended use. But for a compliance inspection, I think we need more effort, we need more detail in the sizing, because it's for that purpose, right? The purpose is to determine whether the thing is big enough to handle the proposed changes. So again, comparison of the system installed against the intended change. Where else are we going? This is probably important. Make sure that your conclusions are substantiated by the information gathered. In other words, demonstrate due diligence. And it does mention that your document could be read by a third party. It may be relied upon, whether it's by a third party or your client, it's going to be relied upon to make some decisions. Right? third party could be like the building inspector or something like that, right? So for that reason, your exposure to liability is greater and the required accuracy is greater. And this is an important point, whether it's for inspections or just planning. This happens surprisingly often. We cannot certify a system that we didn't see go in the ground. Right? And certainly an inspector can't. You know, if you find that there's no filing, system was put in 2 years ago, you can't create one. You know, you might be able to hire a professional to do that. But the filing says that you've done your own soil analysis. The certification says that the thing was put in as per your plans and specs and as per standard practice in the SPM. Well, you can't do that if you didn't see it go in. So don't fall into the trap of what's the phrase I'm looking for? Trying to make an illegal system legal. Right? You're just going to get in a lot of trouble for that. If the system does not have a filing, if it's in that sense non-compliant with the regulation, that doesn't mean that the prospective buyer or the seller have to necessarily do anything about it. Right? They can still buy the house, and you know, now your job is to report that there's no permit on file. You know, most likely they've thrown it out or forgotten it in some back drawer of the health office, right? Or there never was one. Or if there's no filing, there's no filing. Then you report that. But then your next task is to comment on whether the thing's working, how big it is, where it is, and whether it's suitable for the use. So it's not necessarily a deal breaker. Oftentimes, a perfectly good system has no permit on record because the health authorities just don't retain them. Any questions? Must be somebody who has a thought or a comment by now. We've got 21 people. How about John or Terry?
Have you checklists at all on your website?
Say what?
Have you got any checklists on your website?
Checklists for inspection?
Yeah.
No.
When you get on the site, there's going to be some things that you need to know and check out.
Yeah, not really. No.
Okay, sure.
No. It's an interesting point though, John, but a lot of people think that checklists are not appropriate, you know, because they're too narrow in scope and that it should be a customized report. On the other hand, there's nothing stopping us from developing our own checklists to keep our practices in order and then create a customized report, right? I mean, that's not a bad idea. But,
no, because I mean, there's going to be some standard things that you have to check.
Yeah, which of course we're going to see on the next page or two, right? So,
Okay.
So if we were going to do a checklist, we would cut, copy, and paste out of the next few pages that we'll get to in here.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, no, good point. Yeah, thanks for the question.
I got a question for you. I had a problem with the health authority getting filing information from a pre-purchase inspection, and I guess they would not allow the buyer any information, and I guess the realtor selling would not get any information for the buyer.
Really?
Yes, for the inspection, and you know, just because I found out that it was somebody had just recently put it in the last 10 years,
Yeah.
which was obviously illegal because it was right beside a riparian.
Oh,
So
great.
so I just wasn't sure if that was because the health authority would not submit any filings or any information to the buyer.
Well, probably they didn't have any filings to provide, though. Wouldn't that be the case?
I don't know. They wouldn't give us anything either.
Yeah, probably because there was nothing, right? If it was, next to a riparian zone, it sounds like it was probably an illegal system put in. But what they would normally do is say that we don't have anything on file, rather than just say, no, we're not going to check.
Like it was the homeowner that actually went and physically talked to them. It wasn't me.
Yeah, well, you might, no offense, but you might have been misinformed by the owner, because the owners have access to that. If you go in as an owner, you can get anything. You can get the old permits, the old permit to construct.
Yeah, but not the buyer.
Not the buyer. No, well, the buyer can through a freedom of information thing, and every realtor can do it. You know, I've got the form. I can get filings from anybody as long as I fill out the form. and so can the realtors. You know, the realtors should have them on their dashboard, right? Because they should be doing this fairly regularly. And I usually ask the realtor to do it, by the way, because it saves me all the messing around.
Well, that's what I told the homeowner. You know, that's what he's there for, right?
Exactly. Now, there is another little issue that maybe what you're alluding to or your people are alluding to is that typically the inspector works for the prospective buyer, which means that you're under no obligation to share that information with the seller.
Right.
In fact, you could argue that you wouldn't do that without the permission of your client because, you know, the seller's not paying you, the purchaser is, right? So I don't know whether I even really heard your point properly. You know, it sounds odd, but for the way you described it, there probably was no filing to share.
It must have been some, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you know, retrieving filings from the health authority is something we should be doing routinely if we're doing maintenance or inspections.
Yeah.
You know, we're supposed to do that for every job, basically.
Preference. Yeah.
Yeah, and they should be coughing it up, and there's no particular reason why they wouldn't. They just need the paperwork for freedom of information stuff, and they want their $25 or whatever it is. So, you know, feel free to get a hold of me if you have any trouble like that in the future. Sometimes a phone call can be helpful to the health authority or something from me, you know.
Absolutely. It sounds good.
Yeah. Thanks for the question and discussion. Anybody else got anything?
Yeah, John,
Yes, sir.
if you're dealing with the newer Type 2 and Type 3 systems and you're there for doing a inspection on them and you're running into these treatment plants that may or may not have disposal or just laterals and so forth attached, where do you fall in, or how do you deal with that particular issue?
So are you talking about combined treatment and dispersal systems without a drain field, like an open bottom thing?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Well, you know, a couple of things. One is that they do have a drain field. It's just directly under the tank, right? So then we went through that a couple of times in previous webinars. You might want to, you know, watch for that if you're going through the previous ones. But the short version is the new SPM makes it crystal clear that we follow the manufacturer's recommendations from the point of application up, and we follow the SPM from the point of application down. And the point of application is where the manufacturer claims that it meets type 2, which is usually underneath some specified sand, right? So it doesn't matter which one of them it is. All three of them have the same scenario where it goes through some media and then goes through some sand. And so it's underneath the sand where it's your problem. You know, the point of application underneath the sand. So then your job as an inspector is to decide whether you have enough VS, vertical separation, and that depends on whether it's gravity or pressure. So, you know, a whole bunch of standards to make that determination in the new SPM, whether every 6 square feet gets wet and so on. So if it looks like a duck and smells like a duck, it's a duck, right? So if it doesn't make the entire drain field wet, then it's a gravity dispersal system, which means you got to make sure it has 3 feet or 5 feet of vertical separation underneath it. But I'm babbling a little bit. Let me get to the point. Your job then becomes deciding whether the treatment plant and the sand layer, the manufacturer's business, is the right size for the use for the DDF. And then underneath that, the drain rock and so on, now it's your job to decide whether that meets the SPM, whether it's big enough, whether it meets hydraulic loading, linear loading, and so on, whether it meets system selection standards, whether it meets horizontal setbacks. And I'm not picking on any one of those guys, any one of those suppliers, but there is a tendency to use those CTDS systems, any one of the three, and then people think the rules don't apply, which is just flat out wrong, right? All the rules do apply underneath the point of application. You can't put them 10 feet from a lake. You can't depart from any of the setbacks. You still have to have vertical separation. If it doesn't make the entire drain field wet, then it's a gravity system. So if you can't do a gravity system, you can't do that system either. What do you think? Is that enough of my sermonizing? Did I make it clear?
Well, yeah, no, I think, yeah, crystal clear. It sounds like a heck of a lot of
Yeah, more or less, although it depends. Now there's a few issues. One is whether it breaches a local bylaw. Some like Lake Country, other places around the shoe shop, Fort St. George, bunch of lakes around the province have local bylaws with setbacks that are in excess of the SPM. And if that was the case, you're probably ethically obliged by the Code of Ethics to report it to the regional district or whoever, and then, of course, if it could pose a health hazard. I mean, if it's 20 feet from a well and the well is downslope, for example, I would suggest that's probably something that you have to report just out of the health hazard issue. If it's if the setback to the perimeter drain was supposed to be 7.5 meters and it's only 5 meters, I don't think I'd be reporting it to anybody. I would just be putting it in the report to the client. So I know it's all a little bit gray, but essentially you're right. Your job is to report it. I think that you need to tell your clients that there could be consequences down the road, but the system is not failed if it doesn't meet every standard. Right? Yeah. I'm sure if I were thinking about all these questions, I might have a longer answer and a better answer, but if you're happy with that, then I'll move on. Sorry, couldn't quite make you out. There's some other noise. Try it again. What was that question? Somebody on speakerphone? Something about.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you crystal clear. Go ahead.
Sorry, that was.
*6 to mute. *6 to unmute. Anybody got any other questions? Questions are good. That kind of discussion is great. Okay. If you guys are okay, let me just see what I had here. We talked about that. You have to be registered private inspector. What else did I have for talking points? We differentiated the two types. So just to review, performance inspection is a general location. It's for real estate transactions, mortgage approvals. Compliance inspection is enhanced performance inspection with more detail. And now you're getting into comparing the capacity of the proposed use, typically for building permits. So two types. And I'll go back into the document. So now we get procedural guidelines for inspectors. And I got to kind of pick and choose what we're going to talk about. If you see anything that you want to talk about, just speak up. But there's, we could go on all night. I think the first point is worth highlighting. There's access needed. So you need to inform more, particularly you need their permission. There's a whole world of trouble waiting for you if you don't have something in writing, even if it's only an email. Emails are great to prove diligence. So the email can say, just confirming that I have your permission to enter your property tomorrow afternoon. Another thing that I think we should be doing is we should have something in writing that says we might break stuff. Like often it's a D box, right? Like we're exposing the D box and it's so corroded that the thing turns to it falls apart the minute we try to access it. Well, we don't want to be on the hook for that. So we should have something in writing that talks about we need permission to enter, we need permission to test, we need permission to dig and disturb their lawn, and by the way, we might break something, in better language than that. So let's move on. Talks about disclosing any potential conflict of interest. Sure. You have to be careful that you haven't worked for the seller before, for example. Right? So watch out for conflict of interest issues. Doesn't mean that you can't do the job. It just means you need to disclose it. You need to disclose it in writing. I did one a few weeks ago, and the purchaser was my daughter, or my stepdaughter. So I had to disclose that, and everybody was fine with it. Moving on, you got to locate, expose, and test things. you have to locate all the components. You know, this is, somebody made a comment about that earlier when I was talking about your job is to determine how big the system is underneath a CTDS. Well, you know, one way in that case would be to get the documents, see what was drawn, and then confirm it. But typically we have to expose all the components, including accesses to all the tanks, treatment plants, pump chamber, and the D-box. If it's an old system, if it's a gravity system, we can't do an inspection unless we found the D-box, really. That's not quite true. I mean, if we can't find it, we can't find it. Then we have to report why we couldn't find it. But in general, we need to dig. We need to find all these things. It's not just the septic tank we have to find, it's the dispersal system as well. And it talks about disturbance to the property. We've had a few complaints where I've seen pictures from the owner where it looks like a bomb went off. The mess was just unbelievable. Typically we have to, you know, dig away the sod and put it to one side, dig away the dirt, put it on a tarp, put it all back together again the way we found it so that it's hard to tell that we were even there. We are supposed to be doing this by hand if we can. If it's more than that, then we could either limit the inspection and report that we couldn't find it because it was 8 feet deep, or we got to make arrangements for the use of a machine. So one of the exclusions I have in my agreements is that it is, you know, $400 to $700, whatever it is, plus, you know, $50 a foot for every additional foot after 2 feet. To expose components, for example. You know, you can come up with your own thing. But you need to protect yourself, because if you find out that the tanks are 8 feet deep, then you better not be committed to a $300 quote, right? I should move on. Where else are we going? If stuff is underneath structures, and this happens all the time, I bet a lot of people online have had this happen, where the septic tank has got a patio built over it, or a part of the house, or driveway, or whatever. You can limit the inspection, but then you have to report that. And that may make the inspection more or less useless, because if you couldn't get in the septic tanks, you're not really accomplishing very much. The other thing you can do, of course, is to arrange for the restriction to be cleared. Enough said. Any thoughts or questions on that? Where else do we want to go? Again, the theme is to inform the client of the limitations. That paragraph deals with a hazard, or things are potentially going to break. One option for you is to just tell them that that's the limit. You know, I couldn't do it. I'm not going to go down an 8-foot hole to get into the septic tank, for example. And here we get a contentious one. I feel almost guilty, because I get a sense a lot of you are online are going, you got to be friggin' kidding me. But no, not really. We are telling you that you need to do a fairly thorough job. You got to find the entire system. You got to make conclusions about it. So it's not an hour-and-a-half job, right? Same goes for equipment. You need a pipe camera. You know, there's no way of doing inspections properly without having a pipe camera. And, you know, feel free if you want to question or comment. I've probably heard them before. You know, people say a pipe camera doesn't work because if there's a blockage you can't see. Well, it's not true, really. You know, it's true that pipe cameras get gunked up and what have you, but tank cameras, a good old camera, an ordinary camera to take pictures of the site, you got to have a pipe camera. You got to have the electronic utility locating equipment. Of course, sometimes the pipe camera has locating heads on it. We have to find utilities. We have to find our system. So how are you going to find it without locating equipment? And then shovels, lifting hooks, probing, measuring tools, and so on. So to be an inspector, anybody want to comment? How much does that stuff cost? I mean, pipe cameras can be from $3,500 to $30,000 or more, but you know, a good one, a suitable one, is probably 10 to 15 grand. Electronic utility equipment, some other cameras and all that stuff, you're looking at a pretty significant investment. But I suppose there's a significant investment to be an installer or planner as well. Anybody want to comment on that? I think it's a key point You know, we got to have the proper equipment. I'm just going like a broken record here, but pipe cameras are crucial, if for no other reason, so that you can find where the D-box is on an old system, and so that you can find where the laterals are and so on. Pipe cameras are awesome. Notice that you do not need a septage pumper truck. You do not need flushing and jetting equipment. You know, that's another contractor. If you decide you need to do some of that stuff, then you hire them. Yeah, I'll move on. You do have to carry out a flow test to confirm all wastewater sources from the building arrive at the system. Sounds kind of stupid maybe, but super important. Otherwise you're going to miss the gray water diversion, you know, or the pipe heading to the creek, or two systems. A lot of times there's an old system and a new system, and they're both connected. You have to get into the house and do flow test from all the fixtures to make sure that they're actually connected to where you think they are, and that it arrives there in a normal manner without gurgling and surging and so on caused by bowed pipes and that kind of stuff. You also have to do a flow test out of the system to the soil dispersal system. If it's a pump system, go ahead and run the pump, right, with the cleanouts open and so on. If it's a D-box, you got to do a flow test while you're looking in the D-box and make sure that it's getting even distribution to all laterals are accepting effluent and so on. So all of that is important, but you can see Ron Hines' influence here. It never really occurred to me that this would be a significant risk, overloading the system, but he points out that you can overload it during a flood test or a flow test and then actually cause a problem. So I'll just leave that for you to consider. My point is you got to do flow testing both from the house to the tanks and from the tanks to the soil. Where else are we going? And that means you need two people, by the way. You need you and the owner on the cell phone, right? So you're outside standing over the tank, you're talking to the owner, okay, flush the next toilet, and so on. A lot of people bring a helper to do that. And then while you're in there, you know, actually walk through the house and give some thought to whether you have any leaking toilets, leaking faucets, and so on. Let's move on. Dye test is not to be used as the only test. Dye test is great if you're trying to track down a gray water diversion or breakout or something like that, but it's not the only thing we do. You need pipe cameras and flow testing and so on. Effluent sampling is to be done. Bummer. I hate that. This, I think, is new. I don't think the old policy actually said that. And now the SPM doesn't say that. The SPM now says we have to do effluent sampling at the initial maintenance call, not the subsequent ones necessarily. So this one annoys me a little bit. Frankly, you know, you could argue that if you're looking in the pump chamber, it's type 2 system and it looks like tea, it doesn't look like pea soup. You know, if it smells right and if it looks right based on your experience, that maybe sampling wouldn't be required. But you didn't hear it from me. Or to put it another way, if you want to stay out of trouble, do what this says and do sampling. So if you don't do the sampling, you're exposing yourself to potential trouble. I guess I'll leave it there. It talks about other stuff we're supposed to expose, including sewage basin located inside a building to test for function, but you're not necessarily required to open it up. It's plumbing code stuff. You are, however, required to open up all this stuff, treatment plants and so on, all mechanical stuff, all treatment devices, all dispersal area components. Treatment devices includes combined treatment and dispersal systems that we were talking about earlier. In other words, you have to have a look at the media, whether it's cloth or peat or whatever it is. You have to assess that. Moving on, we'll try to pick up the pace here a little bit. It talks about field notes, reports, photographs, videos. You have to take photographs. If you were here at the earlier webinars, you know that the SPM now has it as a critical standard. You have to take photographs, regardless of what type of work you do. And for inspection, you're insane if you don't. You know, I mean, there's so much risk and exposure to liability that you need photographs to protect yourself. You also need them just to prove your conclusions. If you say that the D-box needs replacing because it's falling apart, you need a picture to show it falling apart. If you're saying that the laterals are clogged, not receiving effluent, you need a picture showing a backup in the D-box or whatever, right? I'll move on. So look after the paperwork. It's the best way to stay out of trouble, and take friggin' pictures. For performance inspection, it's a general sketch. It doesn't have to have a whole bunch of detailed dimensions and so on, but it should show the layout of the system. For compliance inspection, now we need more detail and accurate reporting for reasons we already talked about. And here's our little checklist for the report. The report needs to include all this stuff. So when you go to tweak your reports and come up with your template, come back here, look at this, and ask yourself whether you've done all these things. Right? Include some photos. You need some computer skills to do this, by the way, or you need to know somebody who does. And you have to explain the performance using the specific terminology. That, by the way, is now the requirement for maintenance as well. The terminology is not in the SPM. The SPM says use ASTT's terminology, and we'll look at that in a minute. You have to compare the system with the permit filing documents. You have to explain repairs and improvements, and so on. You can read this. You don't need me to read it for you. And here is the terminology. So this is important, once again, for both maintenance reports and for inspection reports. You have to use this terminology. This terminology has to appear in your report. No, for one thing, because we say so, frankly. For another reason, because we spend a crap load of money on lawyers to help you stay out of trouble. Right? I hope you don't see it all as a burden that we're trying to be difficult. We're trying to help you stay out of trouble. The system is operating in a normal manner as intended by its design. Those exact words, if it's true. Not the system is just fine, you shouldn't have any trouble. Not the system's working great. Not the system has passed. But that. Any questions? Anybody want to comment? I guess I'm assuming it's kind of obvious that we don't need to microanalyze the legalities of it. But if you say the system's just fine, you won't have any trouble, and then they have trouble, now you're in trouble. That was too many troubles. But if you say the system is operating in a normal manner, and then a month later it's not, you're in less trouble. And here's the explanation of all that stuff. Let's move on. The next one you can use, it's working, but there's a partial restriction or backing up. So it could be that there's a partial backup in one lateral out of 6 or something like that. It could be in a gravity system, for example. They're all receiving flows, but there's some variation. Some of them have some degree of clogging, other ones are working great. In a pressurized system, flows are visible from all the laterals, but one of them has a different squirt height, for example. Right? Maybe we got some clogged orifices, maybe we got some other problems. All of those things would be that it's that language. Clear as mud? Performance malfunction. That's the $1 million phrase. Not the system has failed. Don't ever say that. You're just putting your ass on the line. If you say something like that, say it's in a performance malfunction if it's not working right, because that has more meaning than it's failed. What does fail mean? Some people might think that you're saying they need a brand new system, but if you say it's in a performance malfunction, that's not saying that they need a brand new system. That is saying that the thing needs some attention. It needs something, and then your job is to say what the recommendation is to get it out of a performance malfunction and back into operating in a normal manner. That might be replacing the whole system. It might not. You might not know. It might be your recommendation might be get a maintenance provider in and do flushing and jetting, and then we'll see whether it needs to be replacing. Or it could be get an installer to do some digging. It could be replace the lid on the septic tank or whatever. But let's move on. Performance malfunction includes not just breakout. It also is if there's less VS than required by the standards at the time of construction. In other words, the standards of the day. So if you're supposed to have 2 feet of vertical separation and you only have 2 inches, then that's a performance malfunction, even if it's receiving it correctly. If you need 2 feet of vertical separation and you have 23 inches, your call. You know, I know what I would do. The fluid level, if there's any backing up, right? Performance malfunction. The backing up could be about bowed pipe. Probably is. Over 50% of the systems have bowed pipes. If there's any backing up, it's performance malfunction. If there's any breakout, you're getting the gist of this, I think, right? I don't need to go through every single detail. Next one, system operation could not be fully determined. And that could be that you couldn't get in the building, it was too deep, they'd poured a deck over it, the digging was too hard, or could be all kinds of things that are all listed here. So you're not responsible to be Superman, you know. If you can't get at it, you can't get at it. You just need to report it. So note that these things could be stacked. It could be that based on the limited access you had, it appears that the system is operating in a normal manner, but system operation could not be fully determined because I couldn't get at the second lid on the septic tank or something like that, if you get the gist. So these things could be stacked together. It could be that, what else could it be? That the system is operating in a normal manner as intended by its design, but the lid to the septic tank is rotten. You know, the planks are rotten, old wooden lid, and now it's a hazard. So what I'm trying to say is these things are not one-offs. They can be stacked together in a report. Let's move on. Illegal or prohibited feature. It could be operating in a normal manner, but it could have a prohibited feature. It could be that it's operating normally, but the number of bedrooms exceeds the DDF. Second residence is hooked up on a system that was only intended for one residence. It could be any of these things, right? It could be backwash from water treatment stuff. It could be that it's operating in a normal manner, but there's a reduced horizontal setback standard. Somebody asked that question earlier. I suppose my answer should have been this. That's a illegal or prohibited feature, but it could still be working in a normal manner. I'm sounding like a broken record here. If there's a potential health or safety hazard, you need to say so. You know, and that includes all those things. Could be breakout, could be electrical hazards, could be that they have a piggyback plug inside the pump chamber, for example. People are still arguing about that, believe it or not. You can't have any friggin' junctions in a tank. That's insane. If you do, then they should be like it's class 4 electrical environment, needs positive ventilation, needs to be explosive proof, it needs to be waterproof, not weather resistant. At any rate, if you decide you're going to put a junction in there, you better make sure it's a good one. And my advice is don't, and certainly don't put a plug in there. Right? When pump chambers, when pump and controls fail, the thing floods. So you got a plug in there, live circuit, and you walk up and touch the lid, or your feet touch the effluent on the ground, and now you're electrocuted. So I should move on. Be sure that you report potential health or safety hazards. In some cases, that means report to the health authority or the BC Safety Authority for electrical issues. In some cases, it's just reporting it to the owner. Kind of your call. Well, yes and no. Here we go. If there's a health or safety hazard, you need to report it. Mentions the health authority. So if there's effluent on the ground, you need to report it to the health authority, even if they don't do anything about it. Your job is to protect your butt, not the health authority's butt. So if you have it in writing that you have informed your friendly local health officer that there appears to be a potential health risk at this spot on this date, then you've done your job, right? And of course you reported it to your client. Safety authority is for electrical. You get the gist of this. Don't forget our friends at DFO, right? If there's a pipe going into the creek, you should probably call out the big guns. So here's some more of these languages, specific terminology for the report. We've got improvement, we've got caution, we've got repair. So in the interest of time, I just want you to be crystal clear, if you didn't take anything else away from tonight, is use those terms. Use that language in your report to save yourself a whole heap of trouble. We're kind of running over time, so I'm going to move on here. It's up to you to self-study this sort of stuff. Talks once again about reporting hazards to protect or limit your own liability. It mentions, here's a good point, that you better be prepared to demonstrate due diligence because you could be a witness in court and so on, oftentimes without much choice on your part. Where else are we going? You have to, this is a good one, we better mention this, is if you are also a planner, installer, or maintenance provider, you can do inspections and you can make recommendations for repairs or replacement, and you can bid on it and you can quote on it, but only if you identify the conflict of interest, only if you do that in writing, and if you encourage the client to get some other quotes. I've never had a problem with inspections. I think one reason is that I try to get the clients to go away while I'm doing it, and then I get them to come back when I'm ready to report my conclusions, especially if the thing is pooched, right? Especially if it's in a performance malfunction. And by the time I'm done showing them, they're pretty much convinced that I'm telling them the truth because they can see it for themselves. Now I can put in a quote on fixing it and encourage them to get other quotes, and they don't accuse me of being a crook because they saw the backup or whatever, right? So at any rate, reveal the conflict of interest and do that in writing. Building departments, what else have we got? Don't forget that you have to stamp these things. Let's look at a couple of examples. Here's one that I did when I took the course. Let me get rid of this stuff here. Sorry about this. Damn computers. So here's a report that I did. I was going to, take away owner's information on some that I've done more recently, but didn't quite get to it. So this is one that I did for the course years ago, but it'll give us a chance to talk about a few things. It's not a checklist, right? It is a custom report. It's not really clear to me how else you could do it and actually capture all the things that those guidelines said need to be here. For one thing, you need the date, the contact information. You need to identify whether it was a compliance inspection or performance inspection. It has to be one of the two. Well, that's not really true. I suppose it could be something else, but then call it something else. If all it was an inspection of the treatment plant, then say so. If it's a compliance or a performance inspection, it's for the whole system. So identify what type it is. Most of us do this. We say, you called me, I showed up, and here was the purpose. Right? Condition, performance, size, capacity, location, and determine if it's adequate to properly treat and disperse the current sewage flow. And in this case, it was a compliance inspection, and the purpose was to determine whether the system was suitable for an addition to the kitchen. It's not an extra bedroom, it's just extra square footage, so that made a difference. And then, like any good report, I think, it should have the summary on the first page, not 5 pages later. And the summary then, in my case, was I'm stacking the terms, right? It's a performance malfunction, it needs repair, and it was not possible to fully determine because we couldn't find everything, right? It was flooded and so on. The guideline says we need to provide an overview of the system and site. So I don't think a checklist works because you need to explain it in language that your client can understand. So, we're not going to take the time to read this now, but it explains what I did and what my goal was, valuation of the system. There was no high-level alarm in the pump chamber. The very large dose, the floats were set too big, that kind of stuff. You get the idea. Then the conclusions. I didn't know what the cause was of the backing up, but I said that that's the goal now, is we need to find out. Right? Let's see now. This all dealt with the fact that the thing was flooded, and we can try to fix that, and then we can come back and carry on. Where else am I going? You'll need minor repairs for the existing septic tank, surface water leakage, need to do sealed risers. You get the general gist of this crap, right? So the point is that we are hopefully creating a credible report, and you've made reference to the guidelines and made sure you've included everything that was in there. And here's one for performance inspection. Again, we can stack the terms, and I think we're going on so late that I should probably leave it at that. Not quite. Sorry. One more thing. Back to the website. Here is where you can get some other examples of reports, and these were done by the other guys, the on-site wastewater registration board, and I have a feeling that Ron Hine probably had a lot to do with these as well. OWRP, not B. There we go. So let's look at the examples. We're going back to the website, practitioner side, documents, top, a little to the left of center, documents. And here's these examples, and then we'll wrap up the night. What should we pick? Let's pick a compliance inspection. Get rid of my pen. So I click on that link, and here's an example that has been looked at and, shall we say, approved or sanctioned by ASTT. So again, our job right now is not to look at every detail, but just to let you know that it's there. A few things we could note. It identifies whether it's compliance or performance. It talks about whether we could find the system records. Maybe there was none available. It talks about the type of system that's present. And it gives an evaluation of the components, and it gives a summary of the performance, and the conclusion was it's operating in a normal manner as intended by its design. Pretty simple. And then it gives recommendations for some improvements and so on. So there's an example. Sketch needs to be a sketch. Doesn't need a lot of dimensions. A few pictures. Photos are more or less required. They're certainly required for you to take, and they're a really good idea to include in the report. And the pictures are intended to prove what your conclusions are. Boy, it doesn't look good there, does it? Friggin' junction boxes inside a pump chamber again. God, I hate that. Flow test. There you go. D-box flow test seems to be working all right. And dye test seems to maybe not be working all right. And pipe camera video, recommended maintenance, and so on. So enough for now, I guess, gang, because we're almost at an hour and a half. Wasn't a whole lot of discussion. I'd sure welcome that now. Has anybody got any questions or discussion?
Participant has left the conference.
Dave.
And of course, anybody was free to leave anytime, but if you don't have any questions or discussion, feel free to log out. Just encourage you to, don't see it all as being an obstacle. I hope you see it as being an opportunity
Participant has left the conference.
on how to do a better job and how to stay out of trouble. If more and more of us start doing the right thing, I think more of our competitors are start doing the right thing. If nothing else, at least if you're doing the right thing, you're going to get your payback sooner or later. Or to put it the other way, if you're not doing the right thing, that's going to catch up to you too. So use those learning resources, access the previous webinars, and so on.
Hello, Jim.
Yeah.